And we are recording too.
Okay. And how do we know if people are on, David, or on, Chris?
I'll tell you right now. Yep, they're trickling in.
Okay.
So I'll kind of interrupt back in closer to 12:30 and say, hey, we got a whole group on.
Okay. Sounds good. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Ed, one of the problems with the pandemic is that we don't get to see Paul
Oh, that's too bad.
playing his guitar
Yes.
in these sleazy bars.
Yeah.
Ed and I have a mutual friend who's an amazing musician.
Who is that?
His name is Paul Spiegel. He was my my roommate in my freshman year in college. So
Okay.
Panelists, you have quite a few people already joining the room, but you might give it one more minute here
Sure, no
before you
problem.
start.
Thank you.
No problem. I don't see Brittany here yet, is she?
I don't see it either.
Okay. Okay.
It's going to be a one-sided conversation. I assume Brittany was the anti-rent control person you recruited, right?
No, she would have made it even more one-sided if she.
I know. I
Oh.
know. I almost, for the sake of argument, was just going to flip sides, and just,
Okay.
what I might still do in my opening comments, though, is make the arguments on the other side, just to sort of, so we can have something.
Okay.
Yeah, I was going to do that as well.
Did you try to find an anti-rent control person? You couldn't find one?
I couldn't find somebody that would sort of fit the profile of what we wanted to do,
Okay.
and somebody who could be articulate.
I run into them all the time. Well, not articulate, but
Okay, yeah. I needed somebody who could do this in a brief amount of time.
Oh, there's Brittany.
Excellent.
Also named David Schultz.
Hey,
That's
Brittany,
right.
Can you rename yourself in Zoom? Do you know how to do that?
Okay. Let me rename myself.
Thank you.
we have 79 people so far.
Okay, great. Are we ready to go, David?
I'm
We'll
ready to
give
rock and
Brittany
roll
a
if you are.
moment. Chris, are we ready? Give me a thumbs up.
You guys are ready to go.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the case for and against rent control on this lovely Wednesday afternoon. My name is Jane Cancier. I'm a planner with Bolton and Mink here in the Twin Cities in Minnesota, and I am here to help introduce and moderate the session. To get started, I just want you to know we're going to use the Q&A format for answers. You can find that either on your Whova web application or on your mobile app. At this time in the conference, I'm guessing many of you already are familiar with it. You can answer questions and we'll try to direct those as we go. So let's get started. I'm going to introduce kind of our lead panelist today, Dr. David Schultz, who is a professor of political science at Hamlin and legal studies at Hamlin University. And he is also a professor of law at the University of Minnesota. He is the author of more than 35 books and 200 plus articles on American politics, election law, eminent domain, land use, and the media and politics. Previously, David has served as a city director of code enforcement, zoning, and planning in Binghamton, New York, and a housing and economic planner for community action. Those of you who live in the Twin Cities, you might see David on many television stations commenting on our current election. So David, I'm going to have you take it away.
Great, good. Let me first introduce the topic, which is the case for rent control, then I'll introduce the speakers. And, Minneapolis, like many other American cities across the United States, is facing a housing affordability crisis, perhaps even exacerbated by the pandemic. Rents, as we know, are going up rapidly, placing middle-class, low-income households into units beyond what they can afford. In fact, in many communities, people really can't even find affordable units anymore. And so there's been lots of efforts, obviously, to try to address this affordability issue. Of course, one of the solutions people propose is just build more units and that will solve it. Not quite a field of dreams argument. If they build, it'll happen. But among the other solutions being proposed is rent control. And if we think about the classic arguments that economists oftentimes give about rent control, the classic economic argument or economist argument is what? That rent control is not a good idea. What they would argue is that housing or like apartments, like any other commodity, respond to supply and demand. They would argue that the only way to really stabilize rents or decrease the cost of housing would be to do what? Would be to actually increase the supply. They also argue that, among other things, rent and control would disencourage the building of new units, create disincentives. It would create, for building, it would create disincentives for renovation. It would also perhaps encourage tenants to stay in their properties way too long and therefore undermine the necessary type of mobility that we would like to see within a community and favor the current tenants at the expense of others. I could develop it a little bit more in terms of the arguments against rent control. Many of us who are planners probably at some point took a class where we talked about like housing affordability and so forth. And generally the argument against rent control is, I'm going to say, the prevailing argument. But again, given the fact that we're seeing in some communities across the United States, including in California and other places, the idea of rent control being reconsidered again, we thought this would be a great idea to present a panel that would really sort of talk about what do we know a little bit about rent control, where it works, how it might work, and things just to consider. And so that you as planners, as community officials could go back and make this part of your discussion. And so that's what we're going to do today. We're going to have three main presenters talking about rent control, each person having approximately 10 minutes, hopefully leaving sometime at the end of our discussion for some Q&A. And let me introduce all three of them right now, and then this will be the order in which they're also going to speak. Peter Dreyer is the E.P. Clapp Distinguished Professor of Politics and founding chair of Urban and Environmental Policy at Occidental College. He's written several books and many articles about housing and urban policy, including his book, Place Matters, Metropolitics for the 21st Century. Prior to being at Occidental, prior to being at Occidental College faculty, he served for 8 years as Boston's Director of Housing and Senior Policy Advisor to Boston's Mayor Ray Flynn, where he's responsible for many things, including revising the city's rent control law. Our second speaker will be Dr. Brittany Lewis, a well-respected community engaged qualitative scholar, leader, author, and professor known for bringing those most often locked out of local decision-making processes to the action research table. And she's been doing that for nearly 10 years. Dr. Lewis is the CEO and founder of Research in Action, a Black and female-led research, community engagement, and racial equity coaching, is currently a senior research associate at the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs at the University of Minnesota. And then Edward Getz is a professor of urban and regional planning at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, University of Minnesota, and director of the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs at the Humphrey Center. He has served on a variety of local and national advisory committees related to affordable housing and community development. He's winner past winner of the University of Minnesota's Distinguished Teaching Award for outstanding contributions to post-bachelorate, graduate, and professional education. And among his publications, the author of New Deal Ruins, Race, Economic Justice, and Public Housing. And so that's our panel. And we're going to start with Peter, again, about 10 minutes each. And I guess the questions as you have for each of us could be put into the chat box. And hopefully we can have a lively and informative presentations and discussions. Thank you in advance to all the speakers.
Great, thank you, David. Hello to the 100 people that are in the audience that we can't see, but we know you're out there. I want to start by saying, what's the goal of what we're talking about today? I hope that the goal is to figure out how we provide decent and affordable housing for all Americans. Some of us believe that housing is a basic right, but that doesn't mean anything unless you can translate that into public policy. And as we know, the 1949 Housing Act says that every American is entitled to decent, affordable housing, but we've never actually fulfilled that right. I don't think we'd be having this panel today or talking about rent control if the United States provided housing vouchers or some kind of subsidized housing for all people that needed it. If we spent that money to provide decent, affordable housing, whether rental or cooperative or home ownership for all low income and middle working class people, then we wouldn't be having this conversation. But as I'm sure most of you know, the United States spends less money on affordable housing than any other democratic country in the world. We spend a lot of money subsidizing homeowners through the mortgage interest deduction and through the property tax deduction. And we spend close to $80 billion on that. It's bigger than the HUD budget. And most of that goes to people that don't need it, to people who are affluent and have relatively sizable homes. So as a housing policy, we need to figure out what do we do in the absence of large-scale subsidies, or what in Europe they call social housing, housing that's outside the marketplace, housing that is protects the long-term affordability of the housing. We have a little bit of that in the United States. We have about 140 million housing units in the country, of which roughly 4 or 5 million, depending on your definition, meaning about 3%, are subsidized by the government through either housing vouchers or direct subsidies to developers, or including nonprofits. That's tiny. Only about 1/4 of all poor people in the United States, poor households, have any government subsidy. So it's not an entitlement. It's not like food stamps or Medicaid. And so as a result of that, we have most people who rent their homes, which is about 40% of the population, about 43% of the 45% of the population. They are subject to the vicissitudes of the marketplace. And I don't have to remind you that rents have been going up much faster than incomes for the last decade and a half or two. More and more Americans, not just the poor, but the working and middle classes, are paying 35, 40, or even 50% of their incomes just to keep a roof over their heads. As home ownership goes down because of the high cost of housing, more middle class people are renting, and that's putting even more pressure on the limited stock of rental housing. So my answer to the question of how do you provide affordable housing for all Americans is the 3 Ps. We need to produce more housing. We need to preserve the housing we have. We need to protect the people that are in that housing from being involuntarily displaced. And rent control is part of the solution, but it's not the only solution. We cannot build our way out of the housing crisis quickly. And as we've seen, and it's gotten a lot worse in the pandemic, people lose their homes at a faster rate than we are adding new housing. Last year, in the United States, 2019, we only built 1.2 million new units of housing. less than a third, about a quarter of that was rental, and almost all that was market rate housing, where the average rents were much higher than most working and middle class people can afford. So we got to do something, and we can't build our way out. And even if, as David said earlier, the development community makes the argument that we can simply build more market rate housing, and then the housing stock will filter down to the poor and the middle class. There's absolutely no evidence that that happens, but they say it all the time. In fact, let me make a very clear point. For the last 50 years, the real estate industry has been arguing that rent control will kill the housing market and will make it almost impossible for developers to build. They've been saying that for 50 years, and all the research with a few exceptions on rent control has been sponsored by the real estate industry. And so, of course, it's mostly propaganda. I was involved in a campaign in California around making it possible for cities to adopt rent control, a state ballot measure. And the research that was used to justify the opposition to rent control was done by these 3 economists at Stanford who cooked their results. They were in the economics and business school. They had formerly worked for Goldman Sachs and other banks. They were subsidized by the real estate industry. And the study that they produced was, I would say, 80% bogus. And if you want, I can go in a lot of detail about their bogus methodology and how they cook the books and so forth. But so that's the problem, right? And David is right that almost every economics textbook says that rent control distorts the market, will discourage new construction, it might be well-intentioned, but it will hurt the very people it's supposed to help. And that's because A, the economists who write those textbooks are relying on theory rather than empirical research. And 2, the extent to which there is empirical research, it's sponsored by the real estate industry. And so the real estate industry has been crying wolf, basically, for 50 years. So let me just make the case. And if you want, I can send you material with my footnotes and everything about this, is that the arguments against rent control are bogus. Number 1, it will kill new construction. There are about 200 cities in the United States that have rent control. They're almost all in either in California, New Jersey, or New York. And you can compare those cities to cities without rent control. And all the research shows that the cities that have some kind of rent control, and there are many different kinds of rent control, which we could get into later, almost all the cities that have rent control have either the same level of new construction or more level of new construction than the cities without rent control. So that argument's bogus. The second argument is that landlords will defer maintenance and turn the rental housing into slum housing because the rents won't provide enough to make the repairs. They used to make that argument in the 70s that the reason why the Bronx in New York had so many slums was because of rent control. In fact, well-implemented rent control laws require landlords to maintain their properties before they can get rent increases. And so what we found in Santa Monica, in Los Angeles, in Boston, when Boston had rent control before the real estate industry lobbied the state legislature to prohibit it, what we found in all those cities is that actually more rent dollars go into maintenance and improvements in the quality in cities with rent control because landlords can't get a rent increase unless they have livable units that are part of the building code. And the third major argument against rent control is a moral one, which is the government has no right to regulate landlords because of free enterprise. And if you believe that, fine, but then that means you don't believe in zoning or anything else. So good for you. Let me make an argument that might be counterintuitive. Rent control is pro-business. It improves the business climate in the cities where it exists. Why is that? Because if tenants are spending less money on rent, they are spending their discretionary income on other things. They're going to the local retail stores, and they're going to restaurants, they're going to the movies. So in a rational world that was not so closely connected to business propaganda, the Chamber of Commerce in most cities should be for rent control. Now, the developers and the landlords won't like that, but the rest of the economy, where people spend their money, those industries should actually like rent control because it put more money into the local economy. And so actually rent control is pro-business. So I said we need to produce more, we need to preserve the housing we have because we can't build our way out of this very quickly. People are losing their homes now, particularly in the pandemic, but when the pandemic is over, it'll continue, that people are being evicted from their apartments because they can't pay the rent. If we had a higher minimum wage, that would help. If we had social housing with more government subsidies, that would help. But in the absence of those things, the gap between rents and incomes is going to continue to grow. And rent control is one tool in the toolkit that cities and counties can use to make it possible for people to stay in place, to have jobs close to to where they live, to spend their money in the rest of the economy, and to avoid the trauma that comes with being fearing eviction or fearing displacement involuntarily. And so the argument I would make to those of you who think that rent control is the bomb that will kill the housing market is that there's no evidence for it, even though almost every economist or every economic textbook says it's true. The fact that they say it's true is simply that they are mimicking the beliefs of the neoclassical economics profession, and they're relying on research that is funded by the rental housing industry. And since we don't, let me finish with this. Since we don't have a panelist who's from the real estate industry, let me recommend that the arguments against rent control are very well articulated in this report published by the National Multi-Housing Council, which is the landlord lobby, called The Impacts of Rent Control, a Research Review and Synthesis. You can find it online. If a student handed me this report, I'd give them a D-, but here it is.
Right, great, good. Thank you very much, Peter. Brittany, Dr. Lewis.
Hello. I'm excited to be here with you all and perhaps ground our conversation in intentional ways. I've had the honor and pleasure in working with community in and throughout the Twin Cities for quite a while to lead what I call community engaged action research project. I worked alongside Dr. Ed Getz on a 2-year study on gentrification, and I also led a 2-year study on evictions. I'm going to talk a bit more about the study in evictions because I really want to ground our conversation in intentional ways around rent control. What is happening, particularly in the Twin Cities, particularly in Minneapolis? What is taking place with renters? And what are organizers on the ground asking and advocating for? So I want to start first at a kind of higher level, and I want to ground us into some of the specifics of what people are experiencing on the ground to contextualize, the issue. And I also can't presume that everyone on this call even knows what we're talking about when we use the word rent control. I think we're assuming a lot when we're sharing. So I want to make sure we can all be on the same page. So, I think, across the US, tenant organizing highlights a number of serious housing concerns, including unsafe and unhealthy living conditions, unresponsive landlords, dramatic rent increases, and evictions. I think 3 of the major national policy initiatives highlighted by tenants, tenant organizers, and housing advocates across the country are right to counsel, universal rent control, and just cause eviction. Now, in this case, we're talking about rent control, and I want to make sure we're all on the same page about what we're talking about. Rent control is a set of regulations on yearly rent increases and the terms of eviction action. And policy sometimes can also restrict how much a landlord can charge for rent based on tenants' eviction history. Rent control was originally a federally price control implemented during World War II, but now it's typically a municipal, county, or state regulation that leads to serious challenges for rent control advocates in states with state level laws regulating rent control on the municipal or county level. While opposers cite studies tying rent control to the reduction in the quantity and quality of available housing, proponents hold that it provides a necessary economic kind of stopgap for neighborhoods experiencing gentrification due to massive reinvestment in real estate and infrastructure after decades of targeted disinvestment. So I mentioned at the top of my intro that myself and Dr. Getz led a 2-year study on gentrification. And what we did in the Twin Cities, and perhaps Dr. Getz will dive into this in a deeper way, I'm not sure, but we did a mixed method study using quantitative analysis to map over the Twin Cities to determine which communities were experiencing gentrification pressures. And one of the 5 cluster areas we looked at were in North Minneapolis. And it also shouldn't shock you then when we later took on the 2-year study in evictions that in Hennepin County, close to 50% of the city's evictions were happening in that particular zip code and or area in which we had identified earlier in our gentrification study, areas that were experiencing gentrification pressures. So when we did the 2-year study on evictions, we looked at 2 zip codes, 55411 and 55412. And you shouldn't be surprised at all to learn that, most, if not, close to half of the renter households had experienced at least one eviction, despite the fact that it only contained 8% of the city's entire rental housing. I'd argue that North Minneapolis is a community manufactured to contain undesirable populations through housing discrimination, decades of urban disinvestment, unfair lending practices, and disproportionate evictions. And I think the situation has become further exacerbated by the rise in distressed property investment. Single Black women with children living below the poverty line lead more than 60% of the Black households in North Minneapolis. And as a result, 67% of the residents are in some kind of county or federal government assistance, really living one crisis away from losing, their homes. I think what's really important to think about here is also the tactics that landlords themselves used in investing in these communities. We interviewed 100 folks, 68 tenants, 32 landlords. Of those 32 landlords, 34% of whom were actually licensed contractors, whereas the rest simply fell into the work, right? Meaning the 34% licensed contractors, 67% of those folks fell into it because they thought it was a good idea, for lack of a better description. And when describing their tenant screening processes, several landlords openly admitted a devastating learning curve. Many landlords stated that they were quite simply sloppy in their initial screening processes, stated that when the market was tough, they would take anyone who could fog a mirror, would end up costing them time and money. Landlords typically describe their tenants using deficit-based language often, including references to high rates of unemployment, domestic violence, intimate partner violence, driving while Black, getting pregnant at a young age, grandmothers raising grandchildren, no boyfriends on leases, etc., etc. These perceptions ensure that any transactional breakdown in the relationship is understood to emanate from these presumed deficits, informing their strategies for mitigating risk. But something else that popped out us at our interview that we have to be, deeply aware of and inform the actual title of the article was called The Illusion of Choice. So for the 68 tenants that we interviewed, only 4 out of the 68 tenants were actually living in a place they desired to live, right? So in short, that means most end up describing choosing a place out of desperation, and or because they were either homeless or moving from a place of homelessness versus being able to choose what is desired to them. So the notion that we all have equal choice, even in the market, to the place where we're funneled to. One tenant stated, I was having a hard time finding affordable housing. Me and my daughters have been searching for 2 months. I couldn't find it. It was getting scary. It was getting ready to get cold out. So I knew I had to get in somewhere. So the first thing that came to me that looked presentable, I accepted. You get put in a desperate situation where you have to take a place even though you don't know anything about it. And and prior to us doing the eviction study, the Minneapolis innovation team put out a report called Evictions in Minneapolis. And, they noted that nearly 93% of the city's evictions filings were for non-payment of rent. And I think if you were to look across the country and you look at, court proceedings, you would see something really similar. And of the tenants we interviewed, 81% of those folks were evicted for non-payment of rent. However, we really want to pull back this notion of what non-payment of rent really means from the perspective of those most impacted. Now, from the perspective of landlords, most stated that they believed simply because they could not get support from local law enforcement to appear in housing court, particularly for lease violations, filing non-payment of rent became the easiest way to get rid of people. But what is not captured in that analysis, however, are the ways that non-payment of rent is being used by many to disproportionately evade tenant rights to be free from retaliation. So in short, we found that, a majority of the tenants that found themselves evicted also found that the reasons for being unable to pay was connected to job loss, death, domestic violence, disputes with landlords. So if you peel back the onion, both in the working relationships and the economic side, let's just be honest, was, the largest side. Folks were unable to maintain their actual lives. They were one car breakdown, one transmission breakdown, one daycare payment away from being unable to pay that bill. And also many tenants would openly acknowledge that they would accept places out of desperation, accept rents they know they could not afford. And every week they're robbing Peter to pay Paul in attempts, I think, to maintain a roof, right? And I think we have this notion or illusion of choice, and we don't all have access to the same choices. So we're having this conversation about rent control. Some of us are more privileged than others to talk about the politics of rent control. And I feel like, when I do these presentations, my goal is always to bring in the voices of those folks that I feel like aren't actually in these dialogues. So let's just be honest about who's here and who's not. One gentleman that I'll never forget this gentleman. I met him at housing court. And I met him the day after he checked himself out of the psych ward. Well, what happened to this gentleman? The city of Minneapolis came to the building that he lived in and condemned it and gave him 15 minutes to move out. And he told me that all I wanted to do was have a drink, right? But instead, he checked himself in the psych ward and I met him the next day. Well, why did this matter so much to him? This person was a former addict, had gone through a program to get himself clean, gone through a transitional housing program, and got his first apartment for the first time in his life. And he was very proud of that apartment. But you could also imagine the condition of that apartment if the city came to condemn it. So people are placed in desperate situations where they're having to agree to things that they can't actually fulfill. And they find themselves one step away from a mental health crisis. That was a huge issue that came up in our interviews. 40% of the people we interviewed were receiving some kind of mental health support services. 10% said that after eviction, I should have sought it out. The question of rent control goes far beyond the politics of rent control. It's the positions I think we're placing people in. Folks are accepting things they know they can't take out of desperation. There's deep mental health crises, issues happening in communities, particularly communities of color, the historic land that they're on has been actively disinvested in, right? So now there's a lot of extractive capitalism that now can come out of it. And they are the first ones to be on the streets. I think something I always think about or reflect on when you think about the Aristotelian idea of the common good. What is the common? And are we talking the same language? Because I don't think we are. I'm more than willing to answer any more questions just about what I see happening on the ground and why I think we need to provide more humanity to this conversation of rent control, because usually we don't.
David, if you could.
David, you're still muted.
You're muted, David.
Myself, sorry. Sorry, I was going to say good job. We have a couple of questions, and I'm going to wait until the end, let Ed get a chance to get his presentation in, and then hopefully have time for questions and some dialogue. Pardon me, I was muting myself when I was not presenting. Go ahead, Ed.
Okay, thank you very much, David, and it's a pleasure to be on this panel with Dr. Dreyer, with Dr. Lewis. So I just want to fill in a few places. The privilege of going third here, the advantage is that I get to then sort of fill in about some things that maybe weren't mentioned. I would like to sort of add to the list of arguments against rent control to sort of supplement what we've heard both from David and Peter on that end. It not only is the argument that it would kill new development, but that it might also lead to removal of existing rental units from the stock, as some landlords or owners might think about conversion to condominiums in order to escape the regulations. In extreme conditions, it is argued perhaps that some owners will take units off of the market altogether, preferring for them to remain empty rather than subject them to rent control while opposition is being mounted to the rent control itself. In addition, there is an argument that is sometimes made that perhaps lenders will react to an environment of rent control where returns to investment might be affected, and therefore this might affect the willingness to lend for development, or maybe to associate that kind of lending with a slightly higher interest rate in order to sort of react to the reduced rate of returns that might be achieved in the market. Another argument that I hear and read about sometimes is that rent control doesn't target its beneficiaries very well. That sometimes affluent people, sometimes people who don't need this kind of assistance will benefit from it. And then finally, in a regional context, I think the argument is made that if a single jurisdiction adopts rent control, this will simply deflect development and investment to other areas, which is something that a city might think about if it were the only one in a region that was pursuing these articles. I will come back to these because I think there are responses to all of those, and we can talk about that at a later point. I want to also then follow up on what Dr. Lewis mentioned about the varieties of rent control and what we think about. I think Peter mentioned this as well. You know, a lot of the economic opposition to rent control is, as Peter mentioned, based on economic theory and how rent controls will interfere with an efficiently operating market. There may or may not be problems with that argument in and of itself, but I think that what's important to note is that most rent control programs in the United States do not apply hard and fast price ceilings to units, to rentals. Most is in a category of what observers call moderate rent control. Almost all of it allows a fair return to investors and landlords. That's built into these programs in the form of automatic rent increases that are either tied to the consumer price index, or they are the consumer price index plus some percentage, right? So rent increases are allowed. and they are allowed to the objective of allowing owners and landlords a fair return, but balancing that fair return against the need to protect affordability and to provide people with affordable places to live. Many rent control programs around the country incorporate what's called vacancy decontrol, which means that when tenants turn over, the landlord has the opportunity to raise rents to the market level. So this is a huge exception and loophole that exists in many rent control or rent stabilization programs that exist. There are hardship exemptions. There are, in some cases, the ability to pass through large capital improvements. So I think the point is that there are policy design options that make rent control, as it is practiced in most places in the United States, much less onerous than what you will imagine by reading the economic theory literature on rent control. So having then said that, I think that probably the other thing that's worth thinking about here is what the reaction of the real estate industry locally may well be, right? If these actors think that rent control is going to limit, oh, wait a minute, there's one other major component of most rent control programs that's important here, and that's that they exempt new development, right? They exempt new construction. So the argument that this will kill new development, of course, ignores the fact that new development is generally exempt from all of these things. So I interrupted myself. I was talking about how the real estate industry is likely to react in a lot of these cases. And it may be by taking units off the market. It may be that they react to vacancy decontrol by figuring out ways of more easily evicting or pushing tenants out to generate the kind of turnover that will allow them to raise rents to marketplace. So I think that it's important when we think about rent control to also think about a set of complementary policies that are necessary to make the rent control effective. I think conversion to condominiums is a process that many local governments control in different ways, and that might be something to think about for local governments that are pursuing rent control. I think tenant protections, just cause evictions, protections from landlord harassment, emergency rental assistance, all of these things should be part of a parcel of either the rent control program itself or the complementary policies that should accompany it as well. Finally, regarding the research on rent control, I don't know as much as Peter about who's paying for these, for all of these studies, but I will note that more and more recent studies are showing a much broader range of impacts of rent control. That it is in fact keeping rents down among those units that are controlled. In some places, it's actually showing that that all rents are remaining lower than they would have otherwise. We can talk about how that might come to be. The research shows that that there haven't been these breaks to new development, and then there have been mixed results on the issue of maintenance. and the quality of the housing stock as well. Almost all the research shows that it does help produce greater stability in the housing of families that benefit from it. So, so I think that you know, the rent control world, the rent control landscape is much more varied than the doomsday scenarios sort of lead us to believe, and the actual outcomes that are now being more and more documented in research are divert significantly from the kinds of things that we've been led to expect by the early economist writings on rent control.
Great, good. Thank you very much to all three of you. We've got a couple of questions here, and I'm just going to pose them here to any of the panelists. Do these studies of rent control in California, New Jersey, and New York include rentals produced by inclusionary housing ordinances? Is that functionally different from a unit that's private and unsubsidized but is rent controlled? Peter, or does anybody, can they address that?
Yeah, well, there's a, you know, Dr. Phillips talked about the politics of rent control, and that's really important. So in California, there are 25 states where the real estate industry has persuaded the state legislature to preempt local governments from either having any kind of rent control at all. In California, cities can only have vacancy decontrol, which, as Ed said, encourages landlords to harass tenants and kick them out so they can raise rents. Also in California, inclusionary zoning was made illegal about 15 years ago by a court case called the Palmer decision, because it said that inclusionary units in market rate housing is a form of rent control. Permanent rent control is illegal because we can only have vacancy decontrol. So in California, there is no rent control on inclusionary rental units, but there is rent control, meaning there can be covenants to maintain affordability on inclusionary ownership units. In New York, the rent control system does not include the agency that monitors rent control does not include inclusionary units, and the same in New Jersey. And there's a big inclusionary housing program in Montgomery County, Maryland, which has been very successful, but those aren't considered rent control units. And in fact, I had a conversation about a month or two ago with the executive director of the Montgomery County Board of Supervisors, whatever they're called. And they want to start thinking about having a rent control system in Montgomery County because the inclusionary program hasn't been big enough to really address the affordable housing crisis.
Others want to answer also, but Peter, just quickly again, somebody asked, what was the name of that study that you held up before?
The study that deserves a D- is called The Impacts of Rent Control, a Research Review and Synthesis by the National Multi-Housing Council, which is the industry lobby for landlords.
Good.
But if you want to get yeah, go ahead.
Good. Jane, how are we doing?
We got about a minute left. I had a couple questions on the Whova app. Julie asks, why wouldn't rent control be tied through tax incentives to make it more palatable? For example, TIF abatement or so on and so on.
Okay, who wants to address that?
Well, that's like saying, why don't you have why don't you have tax breaks for people in buildings that have to have smoke detectors? You know, I mean, you know, why make it more palatable when it's already palatable? You know, if we give away the store, how many libraries are we going to close? Because if we give landlords tax breaks, landlords, as Ed said, there's a lot of evidence. Landlords can make a profit in cities with rent control, and they do. In fact, it's baked into the legislation that they have to have a fair return. Let me respond to two things that Ed said. One, condo conversion. When I was the housing director in Boston, very progressive mayor, modestly progressive city council, we banned condo conversions if the vacancy rate was below 5%. You can do that, right? There are ways to address these perversions of rent control. Vacancy decontrol is a huge problem because it, as Ed said, it encourages landlords to kick people out illegally, which happens all the time here in LA. And finally, the issue that rent control, there's a few rich people that live in rent controlled apartments. Yeah, that's true. So what? Ed Koch lived in a rent control apartment. Mia Farrow lived in a rent control apartment in New York. But 85%, according to one study, 85 to 90% of the people that live in rent controlled apartments are low and moderate income people. So I'm willing to have that trade-off.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. We are out of time. There is another question out there on Whova. I'll see if I can get an answer and post it. But this just shows that this should probably be a much longer session.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you all for attending, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you all for coming.
Thanks.
Thank you all for participating.
Thank you.
David, the last question
Yes.
is, can anyone speak to the impacts on rent control policies brought about by private equity firms buying up all the rental stock in our cities?
Jane, there's still 92 people on the call. Can we just continue until people drop off or what?
I don't know. We can try. You can try to answer it. See
Go ahead.
what happens.
Okay. So one of my former students at Occidental, a woman named Maya Abood, got her master's degree in city planning at MIT. And she wrote the first study of absentee corporate landlords, and particularly Blackstone. And what she found is that they were, in a few cities like Atlanta, Los Angeles, they were buying up a lot of the foreclosed and underwater single-family homes. But those homes are exempt from rent control because every city in the country that has a rent control law exempts single-family homes. But that's no longer a viable approach because it's fine to exempt people that live in their own homes from rent control, or if you have an in-law apartment in the back, to exempt that, or if you have one other you own another house down the street or in another part of the town, to exempt that. But in Atlanta, Blackstone owns thousands of single-family units, so they're basically multifamily landlords. So in the Proposition 21, which is now before the voters in California, which will be voted on November 3rd, although some people like me are voting early, it exempts all single-family occupied homes from any rent control. This ballot measure would allow cities to have real rent control, what Ed called moderate rent control, without vacancy decontrol. But it exempts single-family homes and people that own 2 or 3 single-family homes, but it does not exempt, in other words, it allows rent control if cities want to have it, on corporate landlords like Blackstone that own multiple single-family homes. And the hard part of that is getting the data to identify, because they operate under so many shell corporations. But in LA, we've been able to figure that out, partly because my former student, Maya Abood, is now the research director for the city housing department. And she's figured out how to penetrate the veil of the limited liability corporations.
So I would agree. I think it's the actions of a lot of these investor owners is making a large contribution towards the current push for considering rent control. And it's very important in the single family stock, as Peter mentioned, but it's also important for what they're doing to the to the apartment stock, because they will often come in and purchase these units and sort of leverage so much debt that rent increases are essentially a part of the business model, and that's what's being financed by banks as well. So it has definitely led to greater pressures for rent control.
Yeah. What I was going to add to it also.
Panelists, I'm going to give you a 2-minute warning. I will need to end the session here in 2 minutes.
Sure. Yeah. I was just going to add to it. I think what the pressures from this type of ownership also do, kind of these investment ones, is really sort of bifurcate the housing market in a different way. You think about it, markets are supposed to respond to local pressures, local market pressures, but at the same time, with these kind of like multi-state, almost multinational housing entities like this, investment houses, they're also trying to maximize return on investment, not just locally, but let's say across a broader market, maybe the United States. And so that creates different types of sort of market pressures also that I think exacerbate the existing problem.
Agreed.
Anybody
you.
else? Jane?
No, thank you, everyone. Again, maybe we should rethink this next year. Hopefully we can do it live. It's an excellent session. Thank you all and those of you who stuck around to hear the answers. Thank you all. Thank you, Chris, for hosting. And we'll leave you now.
Right. Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Yeah.
Bye.
Peter, best of luck to the Dodgers.
Look, they had great momentum in the ninth inning. They're